Welcome. I'm Dan Setzer, an historian with the 57th Bomb Wing Association. And today I'm going to give a presentation hitting some of the highlights of the history of the 57th Bomb Wing during World War II. The bomb groups that made up the 57th Bomb Wing were in service for a full 3 years during World War II. So I cannot possibly hit all of the highlights of their service during that time, but I hope that the ones that I've selected to share with you, you'll find to be interesting and informative. So let's get started. In the beginning was Columbia, South Carolina. The groups that came to make up the 57th Bomb Wing were created administratively in 1942. And by mid-1942, they were all headquartered at Columbia, South Carolina. The air base at Columbia, South Carolina, like all of the other military bases throughout the United States, were struggling to keep up with the massive inundation of new personnel coming in as America ramped up for war. You can see from this photograph here, the men were housed in hastily constructed tents. The barracks had filled up almost immediately. They didn't stay at Columbia very long. They eventually moved on to Walterboro, South Carolina. In Walterboro, South Carolina, they continued their training, and they also continued preparing to deploy to the combat zones. My father, he's the individual in the center there. That's his buddy Joe Nichols on the left. And the other genetic mutant on the right, I've not been able to identify. But my father was drafted into the Army 5 months before Pearl Harbor. And when they set up the 340th Bomb Group in Columbia, South Carolina, he was transferred in to be part of the headquarters squadron of that unit. So he was with the 340th Bomb Group from its beginnings in Columbia until the group was decommissioned in Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1945. As I said, they were continuing doing their training here, and sometimes we don't appreciate, I don't think, exactly how dangerous it was to train for war. During the war, the Army Air Corps, that's the entire Army Air Corps, not just our group, our wing, but the entire Army Air Corps lost 52,173 men in combat operations. But they also lost 25,844 men in non-combat related accidents. More than half of those were within the borders of the United States. At this time, the 310th Bomb Group, the 319th, and the 321st Bomb Group were all assigned to the 12th Air Force. The 12th Bomb Group, another B-25 group known as the Earthquakers, and the 340th Bomb Group were assigned to the 9th Army Air Corps. They both served in North Africa under direction of the British, strategic direction of the British. And it wasn't until after the Sicilian campaign that the 12th Bomb Group was packed off and sent to India to serve in the CBI theater, the China, Burma, India theater. And the 340th Bomb Group was transferred to the 12th Air Force, where it remained for the rest of the conflict. In October of 1943, after the groups had been in combat for over 10 months, we see this entry in the war diaries of the 340th Bomb Group. It says, "Another change in administration came up for us when we learned that we've been transferred for administration from the 12th Air Support Command to the 57th Bombardment Wing. No effective date was given, and they haven't even informed us of the location of the organization or to whom we should report. None of us have heard of the 57th Wing, so we conclude it must be some new creation." And it was a new creation. A word about the 319th Bomb Group. The 319th Bomb Group was definitely a part of the 57th Bomb Wing. However, their wartime experience was very different from the experience of the other groups that we think of as being in the 57th Wing. For one thing, as you see here in this photograph, they were flying Martin B-26 twin-engine bombers instead of the Mitchell B-25s. They were very often stationed at areas widely diverse from the other groups. Here you see them taking off from their airfield on Sardinia. On Sardinia, they had the luxury of having an airfield that was so wide that they could take off 6 aircraft abreast all at one time. This made forming up their formations much easier as they went out on to a mission. They flew the Martin B-26 bombers up until October of 1944. The Martin Marauders had gone out of production and replacement parts were becoming very difficult to find. So without missing a single mission, they trained on the B-25s and they made the transition to the B-25s. They flew B-25s out of Corsica along with the other groups in November and December of 1944. But in January of 1945, they were packed up and sent back to the States, where they trained on the new Douglas A-26 twin-engine bombers. After they had trained on those bombers, they were sent to the Pacific, where they engaged in activities for about 2 months before the war ended there. After the war, the 319th Bomb Group elected to have their own reunions and not join in with the rest of the 57th during their reunions. So as we go on in this presentation, the 319th Bomb Group kind of drops out of the discussion. There was the northern route, and this was used mostly by the 310th and the 319th. It started in the United States, went to Nova Scotia, to Greenland, Iceland, and then to the United Kingdom. From the United Kingdom, they flew to the coast of North Africa, making a wide detour around Spain, which was neutral at this point and did not allow military flyovers. This route was very treacherous. The weather was unpredictable. It was very difficult to hit these airfields, and the 310th and especially the 319th lost a number of aircraft trying to make this route. The other option was to take the southern route, and this was used very much by the 321st and the 340th. It would start out in the States, then they would make a hop to Puerto Rico, and then they would hopscotch along the northern coast of South America until they got to Natal, Brazil. At Natal, Brazil began the scariest part of the trip. The southern route was a total of 13,000 miles. It took 60 hours airtime, and it really tested the absolute limits of what a B-25 could do. The hop from Natal, Brazil to Ascension Island was 1,400 miles and 8 hours airtime. Even with auxiliary gasoline tanks stowed in the bomb bay, by the time they reached Ascension Island, they were basically flying on fumes. The airfield at Ascension Island, the whole island is only about 6 miles across, stuck out in the middle of the South Atlantic. If the navigators missed the island, the aircraft generally would usually not have enough fuel to go flying around trying to find the radio beacon to make their way in. Once they left Ascension Island, they hit the coast of Africa, and then they hopscotched along several airfields along the coast of Africa until they made their way to Corsica. When they got to Africa, they found that conditions there were very primitive. You see on the left here a dugout tent that's dug 4 feet into the ground. My father told stories about having to empty his boots out to make sure there weren't any scorpions that climbed in there during the night. In the photograph on the right, you'll see a cloudy image of a B-25 in the background. This is actually a very sharp picture, but the aircraft is enveloped in a sandstorm. And if it wasn't for the sandstorms, when it rained, everything flooded out. One of the principal activities of the groups in North Africa were what was called the sea sweeps. Sea sweeps were very low-level attacks, and being so low-level, as you can see in this photograph, if they had engine trouble or if they were hit by enemy fire, bailing out was not an option. The best you could hope for would be to ditch the aircraft, which was a much more risky operation. Here's a photograph of a B-26, probably of the 319th Bomb Group, making an attack on a type of cargo ship used in the Mediterranean known as a caïque. The Germans also used another transport, which was known as the Siebel ferry. The Siebel ferry is kind of a pontoon boat. They were very cheap and easy to construct, and they were very versatile. They could be used to carry personnel or cargo, or they could be used as a gun platform. You'll see in the photograph below that there's a full battery of Flak 88 cannons. In this photograph, you can just make out the barrel of the 2 Flak 88s at the back of the aircraft of the ship. There were also 2 20mm cannons on this. This arrangement could deliver quite a fearsome amount of firepower. We have an account of what it was like to engage with the Siebel ferries. Keep in mind that the range on a Flak 88 is about 30,000 feet. That's about 6 miles. The range for the 50 caliber machine guns on a B-25 is about 5,000 feet. And a good gun crew, a good German gun crew, could get off 15 to 20 rounds per minute. So this is what it was like to go on a sea sweep. This is Sea Search, February 23rd, 1943. 6 B-25s were sent out on a fishing trip and discovered 13 Siebel ferries headed for the harbor of Bizerte. Captain Eddy, the flight leader, studied the direction and strength of the convoy and knew it was going to be rough. There was no discounting the tremendous firepower possessed by the ferries. On command, the formation swung into an echelon preparing to attack. Time crept along until they made their final turn and were committed. Then it raced as they hurled themselves in a dash to attack. Nerves strained and fingers tightened around twin throttles in an attempt to press past the mechanical stops, encouraging every ounce of power from the gut-straining engines. Engines, little worn from battle, began to trail thin streaks of oil smoke as pistons crashed inside cylinder walls, urging the ships ever faster. Skimming over the waves, the 6 charged the ferries. Airspeed around 200 miles an hour. Each ship creating furrows in the water as if pulling twin invisible plows. The heavy guns of the barges opened up with their crescendo. Shells hit the water in front of the formation, but no answer came from the bombers, as gunners and bombardiers waited for the range to decrease. On they flashed in an unbroken line, each pilot holding his path to his own personal target. When the distance lessened to effective range, the bombers answered back as bombardiers fired their Flex 50s, top gunners opened with their Twin 50s, and the radio operators fired their usually ineffective lower turret 50s. The stench of burning cordite filled the ship as the deadly shootout continued. Quickly, the bombardiers abandoned their guns to prepare for the drop. As the distance closed, the German gunners, who now had found their range, began to pound the bombers, ripping gaping holes in the wings, tail assemblies, and fuselages. Pilots struggled to keep their ships together and on a straight line long enough to disgorge their bombs. More and more hits were scored by the Germans as bomber engines burst into flames and white smoke poured from ripped cowlings. Then the shout of "bombs away" rang out, and over the top of the barges they flew to escape the lead hell. The distance between aircraft widened as they twisted and turned in evasive action, trying to escape the withering fire from the barges. Aboard the remaining planes, hydraulic systems were damaged, electrical systems only half worked, and many of the crewmen were wounded. After the attack, we found there were only 3 of us left. The entire lead element was gone. On May 13th of 1943, the German and Italian armies surrendered in North Africa. This was the position of our 3 groups at that time. Everybody knew that the next phase was going to be the invasion of Sicily, but there were 2 problems. One here and one here. These were the 2 island fortresses of Pantelleria and Lampedusa. These islands represented a threat to our supply lines and to any invasion force that we might be sending from Africa to Sicily. In order to take them out, the 57th Bomb Wing, along with other American and British air groups, began pounding these islands day and night. For 10 days, they pounded them until finally both of these islands had to surrender. It marked the very first time that territory had been won by air power alone without the need for ground troops. The 57th Bomb Wing supported the invasion of Sicily. Here you see a photograph of the 489th bombing the German airfield at Camiso, Sicily. In a sense, it turned out that the joke was on them, because after pretty much destroying the airfield, they were assigned to work out of that airfield. So the airfield had to be repaired so that they could operate out of it. It seems like the Germans who had occupied that airfield had to evacuate very quickly, so quickly that they ended up leaving a lot of personal items behind. And when the boys of the 489th discovered a bunch of German uniforms, they could not help but to play dress up and to do some horsing around with them. In addition to personal items, there were also a number of aircraft left behind in various states of disrepair. This was a time when farm boys were used to tinkering with tractor engines, and the city boys and small town boys had jalopies to work on, and they actually were able to scavenge parts from other aircraft that were on the field and get some of these German airplanes up and flying once again. However, after a couple of fatal crashes, the Army brass put a stop to that practice. From Sicily, the groups moved on to the heel of Italy. You'll notice that the 310th Bomb Group in October of 43 was still in North Africa, but the 321st and the 340th had moved into Italy. They found that from this location, they were able to reach targets in Greece and Yugoslavia, as well as into Bulgaria. We have an account of the attack on the capital of Bulgaria, the city of Sofia. This account was written by Lieutenant William T. Williams of the 447th Bomb Squadron, and this was his mission number 50 to Sofia, Bulgaria. When the groups first got to North Africa, in the very first days that were at North Africa, a tour of combat duty was considered to be 25 missions. That was the same as the B-17 heavy bombers that were flying missions out of England. However, almost immediately, it was realized that the mission of the heavy bombers and the mission of the medium bombers were very different. The heavy bombers moving out of England would be over enemy territory almost immediately once they crossed the English Channel. And in order to strike targets deep into Germany, they could be over enemy territory for 6 or 8 hours, having to deal with multiple waves of fighter aircraft coming up to meet them, not to mention flak over the target. On the other hand, the medium bombers might only be over an enemy target for an hour or two, since they do not have the same range as the heavy bombers did. So almost immediately, the number of missions that constituted a tour of combat duty was raised to 50. And as we all know, later on, as the war progressed, the limit was raised to 60, then to 70, and then for the final push, they removed the limits altogether. But this is Lieutenant William T. Williams' 50th mission to Sofia, Bulgaria on November 14th, 1943. He says, "Insurrections in the Balkans have increased lately, and today's raid was to scare up a little more unrest, besides cutting the communications that supply the South. 96 B-25s and 48 P-38s made the trip to Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. Spitfires, about 24, and Samachi 202s escorted us to the coast of Albania to ward off any fighters that might come up from the fields along the coast. Into the target we flew at about 12,500 feet. When we got to Sofia, the Germans had set off smoke pots along the perimeter of the city to obscure the target. This was effective and made bombing difficult. Our target was a huge railroad marshalling yard on the northwest side of the city. There were nearly 1,500 pieces of rolling stock in this yard. Also, over 80 locomotives, repair sheds, turntables, and warehouses. The railroad lines through Sofia are the main lines between Berlin and Istanbul. We were carrying 500-pounders, with one in each ship having a delay of from 1 to 24 hours. This should give them something to worry about for a while. On the bombing run, they threw up flak from the fields all around the city. I could see at least 10 different gun positions along the south and west sides of the city. This was all heavy stuff, rated as intense and accurate. Coming off the target, we broke to the right to miss an airfield that lies northwest of the city. Just about this time, I saw 4 or 5 strings of tracers coming up just off our left wing. Must have been 40 millimeters. We were at 9,000 feet. Naturally, we did a little super special evasive action so that these gunners couldn't line up on us. Fighters hit the scene just about this time, a few in front of us and the rest in the rear. Some made passes at the last flight, but the 38s took care of these. I looked back at the sky to see just how much flak we had drawn, and what a barrage it was. At briefing, they told us we were going to show these people that there was a war going on. I believe they know it now. The trip back was uneventful. Spits and Machis met us at the coast again. And so I write fini to a tour of combat. Well, it turned out that this wasn't Lieutenant Williams' last combat mission. The replacement crews were slow in arriving, so he had to fly a few more missions. On December 2nd, 1943, on his 52nd mission, Lieutenant Williams' aircraft was shot down, and he and his entire crew were killed in action. From the heel of Italy, the 340th Bomb Group and the 321st moved to airfields close to Naples. The 340th Bomb Group was stationed just southeast of Mount Vesuvius near the ancient city of Pompeii. And they were there on March the 20th, 1944, when Vesuvius blew its top. The mountain started spewing out vast amounts of ash and kicking up hot lava cinders, some as big as grapefruit, which came raining down on the airfield. All of the men had to wear their steel helmets, and every one of them had stories of listening to these hot rocks come pinging off of their steel helmets. The ash was just immense, and you can see here how thick it was. Notice in the tent, the holes in the top of the tent that were punched through by the hot lava cinders falling from the sky. In addition to the damage to the airfield, the 340th Bomb Group lost its entire fleet of aircraft. The hot cinders falling from the sky set fire to the cloth control surfaces on the wings. They also crashed through the plexiglass on the turrets and on the bombardier's greenhouse, smashing through them. The weight of the ash was so heavy that it caused many of the planes to tip down onto their tail. The 340th had to move in to the airfield along with the 321st, which caused horribly overcrowded conditions and made just everybody miserable. But fortunately, by now, the airfields in Corsica had been prepared and were ready for occupation by the 340th and the 321st. The 310th was already in Corsica. They had gotten there in December. So here's a map of what came to be called the USS Corsica, the island aircraft carrier. You can see from this map that there were a total of 17 airfields set up by the Allies on Corsica. It's interesting to note that when they arrived in Corsica, they were, in a very real sense, operating from behind enemy lines. The red line here is the Gustav Line, which was being defended by the Germans at that time. The linchpin of the Gustav Line was Monte Cassino. Until Monte Cassino fell, Corsica had enemy territory to its east, to its north, and to its northwest. In a very real sense, they were operating from behind enemy lines. Flight time from the coast of Italy to Corsica is only about 20-25 minutes in those days. It's amazing that they weren't under more attack from the fighter groups in Italy. After the Gustav Line fell, the Germans fell back to the Gothic Line, which they maintained until the end of the war, until it was finally conquered. The airfields in Corsica, in Giscanaccia and in Alessani, were built by the 41st Engineer Regiment. This was an all African-American regiment, and in addition to being crack engineers, there was another advantage. Some of these guys had been, when they were drafted, they had been playing in the big bands in Harlem. They were professional musicians who had been playing for the likes of Duke Ellington, Ethel Waters, Cab Calloway, and when time permitted, they gave performances for the troops, and every one of our war diaries mentions the really great performances that they put on, and their contribution to entertaining the troops was greatly appreciated. On Giscanaccia, the 310th Bomb Group was lucky in that this was the site of a small village. And you can see these stone buildings in the background. They were probably built in the 1700s. They had no plumbing, they had no electricity, they had no running water, but it was a roof over their head. And for the lucky officers who were able to find a cot there, it was a much better situation than being in a tent. The guys at the 340th Bomb Group and the 321st weren't so lucky. Both of those airfields have been carved out of farmland, and as a result, there were no buildings to take over. Everybody had to make do living in tents. This is the movie theater and also stage for the 310th Bomb Group at Zhizkanachiagar. The building in the background there was the Red Cross Club. Notice that all of the seating is outside. The GIs were so hungry for entertainment and so hungry for a touch of home that when movies were shown here, they would sit out in the cold or the rain or the heat just to watch these movies. And they also had USO shows occasionally, and they made their own entertainment. Here's a show that's being put on, a comedy skit. You can see here that the Master of Ceremonies is inspecting the medals of this obvious war hero on the right. And notice in the background, the music stands. The 321st had set up its own band, and they called themselves the Michelaires. Sports were also very important. Here we see a baseball game in progress at Zhizkanachiagar. Volleyball, baseball, basketball, horseshoes, card games, all of these were important entertainments that the GIs used and needed in order to get some sort of rest and relaxation between missions. This is the man who tried to kill my father. This is Joachim Helbig. He was the commander of the bomber units in Italy, and he was one of the masterminds to put together the raid on Borgo and on Alessani in May of 1944. Helbig was a very interesting character. He was serving in the German Luftwaffe from 1940 to 1945. According to German propaganda at the time, there was nothing that young German men loved more than the thrill and excitement of combat. The whole idea of testing your skills against a worthy enemy in a life and death struggle was just something they just couldn't get enough of. As a result, there was no such thing as a tour of combat duty. You flew and you flew and you flew until you couldn't anymore. Joachim Helbig himself is credited with 380 combat missions. After the war, he became the manager of a brewery in Berlin, and after surviving the war, having his plane shot down on 2 or 3 occasions and receiving multiple wounds, he died in a car crash in 1986. The raid on Borgo and Alessani was masterfully planned and masterfully executed. The Germans began at their airfield in Gedi in Italy. They managed to scrape together 90 Ju-88 twin-engine bombers. They started at night from Gedi, flew down to Florence, made their turn, dropped down to 300 feet, skimming over the Italian hills until they reached the coast. Then they dropped down to 150 feet over the water. All of this to avoid the radar. Once they approached Corsica, they climbed to 9,000 feet, which was their attack altitude. They reached the airfield at Borgo, in northern part of the island, at 8:30 at night. And when they dropped their magnesium flares and lit up the field, it would have looked a lot like this. They came through in waves, dropping their bombs. Then they returned, and strafed the fields until they ran out of ammunition. They got lucky at one point and actually hit the fuel dump, which caused a massive explosion and fire. The boys at Alisani, farther down the coast, could see the flashes of light in the sky and hear the rumble of the bigger explosions in the distance. And they knew that there was a show going on farther up the coast. But there was nothing they could do about it, and they had to fly missions the next day, so they all went back to their bunks and went to bed. Unbelievably, the Germans returned that same night back to their airfield in Getty, and in the middle of the night, they refueled and rearmed 90 aircraft and returned by the same route, this time coming for Alisani. Why did they hit Borgo first? Because that's where the fighters were stationed. They wanted to take the fighters out of action first so that they would not be disturbed when they came back to hit the bombers in Alisani. The aircraft at Alisani had been fully fueled and loaded with bombs in preparation for the next day's missions. And when those received a hit from the Germans, there really wasn't very much left of the aircraft. The ground crews took the brunt of the attack. The ground crews were in the habit of pitching their tents next to the hard stands where their aircraft would be parked. It made it much more convenient to service the aircraft in the evening, in the afternoon and the evenings, to prepare them for the next day's missions. But when the bombs fell, they were the principal victims of that bombing. A total of 21 men were killed, and 114 received injuries severe enough that they had to be evacuated to the military field hospital a few miles away in Cervione, and many more were treated at base. And if it wasn't for the bombs, the strafing and the shrapnel caused a great deal of damage also. The 340th lost nearly all of their ships in this attack, but they did manage to scrape enough aircraft together to fly a mission late that same afternoon as an act of defiance to the Germans. In August of 1944 began Operation Dragoon. Operation Dragoon was the invasion of southern France. It started out slow for the 57th, with the group being assigned targets in southern France, around southern France, and also in western Italy. They didn't want to concentrate their attacks too closely to give away the position of the invasion itself. But once the invasion did begin, it was all hands on deck. You see here just a portion of the ships that were involved in this invasion. One of the veterans that took part in this invasion told me that he was less concerned about the flak coming up from the ground than he was concerned about the possibility of having a collision with all of the other aircraft that were in the sky at the same time. If you think back to that map of Corsica, all 17 of those airfields were bristling with aircraft brought in from North Africa and Italy of every size and shape and allied nationality you can think of. And they were all in the sky at the same time. The Germans defended southern Italy vigorously. One of the more notorious targets was the bridges at Avignon. And you'll recall that the fierce opposition from the Germans over Avignon made this a feared target. And the mission to Avignon forms the climax of Joseph Heller's book, Catch-22. From the invasion of southern France, the next major operation was Operation Bingo, which began on November 6, 1944. This is the beginning of what came to be known as the Battle of the Brenner. Operation Bingo had all of the groups flying into the Brenner Pass, and the target was the electric generating stations all along the route that provided electricity to run the railroads, to run the engines. It was tremendously successful. Every one of the power stations was knocked out. This is what the power generating station at Ala looked like after the attack. Electrification was not replaced until after the war. This caused the Germans to have to divert steam engines into the Brenner Pass in order to keep things going. The Brenner Pass, of course, was the absolutely vital supply line for their armies in northern Italy. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with this map of the Brenner line. The red outlines show the range of the heavy guns that were stationed throughout the Brenner. At its peak, the Germans had over 700 Flak 88 guns covering almost every inch of the Brenner Pass. This is what a typical gun battery would look like. You'll notice that in this case that it's dug down into the ground. The other option was to build up earthen revetments around the guns. This made them almost impossible to take out with anything less than a direct hit. The Germans had a very sophisticated system for fire control. This is the optical tracking device that they used. It took 5 men to operate it. They would use this in order to calculate and observe the altitude, the direction, and the speed of the bomber formation. And as they tracked it, they would make adjustments with the dials that they had at their disposal. That information would be transmitted to a sort of analog computer. The analog computer would attempt to predict where the aircraft formation would be when the rounds from the guns reached altitude. You'll notice on this photograph 2 sets of double gauges and these hand cranks at the bottom of the gun. The analog computer would send readings to the top gauges, and one hand crank would either elevate or lower the barrel. The other hand crank would move the gun to the left and to the right. So from the point of view of the gunner, all they had to do was to turn the crank until the reading on their gauge matched the reading on the gauge that was sent to them from the fire control device. From their point of view, it was a very simple system, and almost anybody could be trained very quickly to do the job. In some places, the Flak 88 guns had been hauled up the sides of the mountains. This is the position of the Flak 88 guns in the town of Ala. You can see Ala is down in the valley there. These guns were located 3,000 feet above the valley floor. Since the rounds from the 88s flew at a range of at a speed of 1,000 feet per second. If a aircraft was at 10,000 feet and the guns were at sea level, it would take 10 seconds for the round to reach the aircraft at altitude. If you have your guns up 3,000 feet above the floor of the valley, then it would only take 7 seconds to reach the target. And this really complicated the evasive action that the pilots were able to take. The wing had to go back after the same targets over and over and over again because the Germans were so damn good at fixing stuff. Some of the bridges, of course, over the Adige River in the Brenner Pass were longer than others. If they had a relatively long bridge and the group managed to take out one of the spans, the Germans had developed a system of portable spans. So after the span was down, in the evening, they would bring out these portable spans, lay them across the original trusses, and they could run their trains at night. Then at dawn, they would retract the portable spans, hide them in a rail tunnel. Sometimes they would park empty boxcars on either side of the bridge to make it look like the bridge was still blocked. And of course, when air reconnaissance flew over the next day, it looked like the bridge was still out. Another technique that they used, which I thought was very clever, in the case of rails that ran along the ground, if our bombers managed to tear up those tracks, the Germans could usually replace them in a day or so. But then after they replaced those rails and got them operational again, they would cover them with canvas tarps on which they had painted bomb craters. So when the reconnaissance aircraft flew over the next day, they would look down and it would look like those rail lines were still out. Meet me over Rovereto. Meet me in the air. There ain't no place, the flak is thicker. No place else but there. We will take evasive action. They will miss us by a fraction. So meet me over Rovereto. Meet me in the air. Well, we're going to go on a bombing run to Rovereto. The Germans had a very sophisticated early warning system. They were located high in the mountains, and as our bomber formations approached, they would already have measured their direction, their altitude, and their speed, so that as soon as we clear this range of mountains in front of us, we're going to be in range of the German guns. And you'll see our target is at the end of this arrow in the distance. So, are you ready? Here we go. You can see from here just how tiny that target looks. Notice these columns of white smoke. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is what the bridge of Rovereto looked like after one of our B-25 attacks. The Germans could actually get this bridge back up and operational usually within a few days, 3 to 5 days maximum. We have an account by a German soldier of his trip through the Brenner Pass. He was a private named Werner Mork, and his group boarded a train in Bremen, headed south through the Brenner Pass in order to join up with the German armies fighting in Italy. And this is what he had to say about the passage. The trip to the Brenner Pass was interrupted by air raids. They were only flyovers of bomber formations on their way to bomb cities in Germany. Nevertheless, the train had to stop somewhere and wait until the skies were clear. Once we got to the Brenner in northern Italy, It was the train itself that suddenly became the target. It had crossed over into the hunting grounds of the fighter bombers who harried trains with bombs and cannon fire. From this point on, there were many disrupted stretches of track, in particular damaged bridges. At those points, we had to exit the train and make our way across the rickety rail bridges by foot to where another train waited on the other side. The Bremen train was no longer a reliable means of transportation. I frequently had to get out and walk. Sometimes on the other side of a damaged bridge, there wouldn't even be a train, but rather a line of trucks that would take us to the next rail station that was still intact. All of this sure raised our confidence that we would win the war, even though the fighter bombers and bombers now had complete control of the skies. This is what the Rovereto Railroad Bridge looks like today. Not very much different than it did in 1944. This is a section from the photograph I showed you earlier. The arrow on the left points to the bridge at Rovereto, and the columns of white smoke on the right are white phosphorus. White phosphorus was used by the Allies, they said, in order to obscure the view of the bomber formations by the German gun crews. All well and good, but the Germans had another point of view on the matter. White phosphorus is an element that burns immediately on contact with air. When the phosphorus canister detonates at altitude, it immediately starts burning and creating these clouds of harmless white smoke. The problem is some of the chunks of phosphorus are so big that they're still burning by the time they hit the ground. And if they hit a person, they're burning at 2,370 degrees centigrade. This will burn right through clothing and right into the skin, making horrible wounds. The Germans considered this to be chemical warfare prohibited by the Geneva Convention, and they kind of had a point there. The Germans also declared that if they captured any crews from the ships who dropped phosphorus, that they would be treated as war criminals and would be executed on the spot. And we know that on at least one occasion when a crew from the B-25s groups were captured, the Germans carried that out. This was more likely to happen if they fell into the hands of the Gestapo than if they fell into the hands of the regular German army. Let's go on another quick bombing run. This one is to the Aldeno rail fill. Once again, our target is on the other side of that range of mountains. The Germans know we're coming, and as soon as we clear that ridge, we're going to be under fire from the guns. So here we go. You see our target is right here at the where the arrow is pointing. Notice how the target is nestled up against the side of the range of mountains on the other side of the valley. This, like many of the other targets in the Brenner Pass, could only be attacked from one direction. You couldn't attack from the other direction because the bombardiers would not have time to line up on that target. So once again, the Germans always knew we were coming, and it was never a surprise. Well, it had been a long and a hard fight, but the men of the 57th Bomb Wing always knew what was worth fighting for. By April of 1945, the veterans who had signed up to attend their final reunion, Dick Reed, Charles Waggerman, Paul Young, Bob Stanger, were all flying missions in northern Italy. At this point, the German army had no choice but to surrender, which they did on April 29, 1945. Germany itself surrendered a week later on May the 7th. There were, of course, some celebrations, but the celebrations were surprisingly subdued. Even though the war in Europe was over, they all knew that Japan was still active and still had to be dealt with. They were all pretty sure that they could look forward to perhaps being rotated home, maybe getting a month's furlough, but then they were going to be deployed to the Pacific to take part in the invasion of Japan. And knowing what kind of a fight the Japanese had put up on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the other Pacific islands, they knew it was going to be a bloody, bloody battle. Fortunately, that did not come to pass. After the war in Europe ended, the GIs were interested to see exactly, what kind of damage they had managed to do to the enemy installations. And those who could, pretty much meaning high-ranking officers who had means of transportation, those who could went out to some locations in the Brenner Pass to inspect the situation. Here we have a picture of Colonel Anthony Hunter, formerly of the 310th Bomb Group, but now assigned to 57th Bomb Wing headquarters, having a talk with his counterparts in the Brenner Pass. I really don't know what to make of this picture. I have a feeling it tells us something about the absurdity of war. But here they are. Just a few days ago, they were trying to kill each other, and now they're all standing around talking shop. The men of the 57th Bomb Wing had a job to do, and that job was to halt the spread of tyranny throughout the world. And they succeeded. And now we have a job to do. And our job is to make sure that the memory of their achievements is never forgotten. So I say to you all, let's keep them flying.